In the frozen fields of Manchuria, science was turned into an executioner. There were no white coats but sharp blades. There were no hospitals but torture chambers disguised as laboratories. There, men, women and children were cut open alive, infected with plague and cholera, frozen until their skin broke like glass, burned by flamethrowers, drowned with gases, used as human targets, forced to give birth to children destined to be dissected. They were not patients. They were material, disposable human guinea pigs in an empire of horror that turned the body into statistics and life into an experiment. Dissections without anesthesia, the horror of seeing your own organs. The silence of the hallway was deceptive. Behind the frozen walls of the Pingfang barracks on the outskirts of Harbin, the muffled screams of men and women served as a prelude to a spectacle of meticulous horror, planned with the surgical coldness of those who saw themselves as pioneers of science. There, in those concrete rooms, the word vivisection acquired a meaning that until then few could have imagined. The prisoners, often Chinese peasants, communist militants, Koreans or Russians captured at the border, were admitted to the facility under the pretext of medical studies. But soon they understood that the illness that weakened them was not by chance. They had been deliberately inoculated with deadly pathogens. Once the fever burned in their bodies or the sores oozed with fetid pus, the moment came when they were led to the operating table. There were no morphine needles, no anesthetic gas, no compassion. Pain was not an accident. It was the raw material of the experiment. The white lights hung over the metal table. The surgical instruments shone under the gaze of the military doctors who wore immaculate coats as if they were university professors about to give a lecture. The difference was that instead of students, they had soldiers attentive to the slightest movement. And instead of corpses, they had living bodies that writhed under leather straps. The scalpel descended on still warm skin, and the objective was to observe in real time how the organs reacted to the infection, how gangrene spread, how the blood darkened on contact with the plague virus. Some prisoners were opened from the abdomen with wide incisions that exposed the intestines. The doctors did not limit themselves to looking. They manipulated tissues, palpated viscera, measured the inflammation of the spleen or the liver, noted with clinical precision each alteration. If the heart beat with difficulty, they paused to study the rhythm of its pulses. If the lungs were invaded by induced pneumonia, they opened thoracic cavities to observe the texture of the tissue, the amount of accumulated pus, the reaction to different stimuli. Everything was recorded in meticulous reports, regardless of the fact that the patient was conscious and tearing apart in unbearable screams. They were not improvised operations nor whims of isolated sadists. Each procedure was part of a structured program. The official justification spoke of medical advances and of the need to protect the Imperial Army from future biological threats. But the reality was simpler and more brutal. A laboratory where human flesh replaced test animals. In the corridors, it was spoken of with normality that pigs and dogs no longer offered useful answers, and that the human being, with its physiological particularities, had to be the final reference. The horror reached unthinkable levels in certain specific experiments. When it was about studying septicemia, the prisoners were opened and left exposed for hours to observe the bacterial spread. Some still breathed when the surgeons inserted thermometers into the interior of their organs, taking note of the growing heat that accompanied the fever. Others were sewn up halfway and kept alive a few more days to open them again and check the progress of the disease. The absence of anesthesia was not a logistical accident nor a sign of precariousness. It was a requirement. The doctors claimed that anesthesia would alter the results, that drugs would modify the body's reaction to the infection, that the purity of the experiment demanded intact suffering. Thus, the subject's pain became the exact measure of the science they pursued. Even among the Japanese military themselves, some young doctors recently arrived from universities of Tokyo or Kyoto felt at first disturbed by the crudity of the practices. But the iron discipline and the nationalist ideology soon molded them. In the official reports, they spoke of maruta, logs, as the prisoners were called. They were not men nor women, but pieces of wood thrown into an experimental fire. That dehumanizing language reduced individuals to simple objects of observation. A peasant woman with eyes wide open in terror was Maruta 34. A child trembling on the stretcher was Maruta 56. The semantic reduction completed the moral annihilation. The routine of the vivisections became an almost administrative spectacle. Each day, several operations were scheduled. The guards brought the prisoner, the medical team secured him, the incision was made, notes were taken, and finally the body was eliminated. At the end of the day, the remains were cremated in improvised ovens or buried in anonymous pits in the surroundings of the complex. No living witnesses remained of what had occurred under the cold light of the surgical lamps. The detail with which the procedures were documented contrasts with the brutality of their execution. In some notebooks, the doctors calmly described the coloration of the infected tissue, the rhythm of agonizing breathing, the size of the inflamed spleen. The terms were technical, distant, almost elegant. The blood that stained the aprons was for them a simple clinical indicator. The contradiction between the impersonal tone of the notes and the tearing suffering of the subject on the table was the characteristic seal of Unit 731. The fusion between science and barbarity, between academic exactitude and systematic crime. There were cases in which the prisoners entered the room without being infected. They were then used to measure reactions of healthy organs. In those scenarios, the surgeons opened abdominal cavities and removed sections of tissue, examining natural regeneration. Others were subjected to forced transplants, kidneys extracted alive and replaced by others previously infected. The majority died in a few hours, but what mattered was to record the biological sequence of death, not survival. The breadth of victims was devastating. There was no discrimination of age or gender. Young men, old women, pregnant women, and children passed through the tables. In the eyes of the researchers, each one represented a different datum, a valuable clinical case. A pregnant woman served to see how the fetus reacted to the infection. An old man to check the resistance of a weakened organism. The spectrum of the entire population was represented in those living dissections. Fear ran through the prisoner barracks. Each time the metallic creak of the doors opening was heard, the inmates knew that one of them would not return. Some tried to resist, but the brute force of the guards was relentless. Others entered into resigned silence, knowing that nothing could save them. What awaited behind the walls of the surgical pavilion was worse than death, and yet death came inevitably in the end. Rumors spread beyond the complex. Nearby villagers murmured about trucks that carried bodies at dawn, about smoke that rose from the ovens at strange hours, about screams that filtered through on windy nights. No one dared to approach. The place soon acquired a sinister fame, as if it were a cursed territory. With the passage of time, the doctors who participated in those vivisections ended up becoming accustomed. Some even boasted of their experiences as if they were professional credentials. It was commented in private that the surgical skills acquired in Pingfang surpassed any university practice. The paradox was that those skills, perfected on living bodies, lacked all ethics and were stained by incalculable suffering. The vivisections of Unit 731 left an invisible but indelible mark. In those rooms, a type of experiment was carried out that defied any known moral limit. What occurred there was a demonstration of how science, stripped of human values, can become an instrument of torture disguised as research. For those who were on the operating table, there was no anesthesia, no relief, no hope. Only the scalpel slowly descending on living skin and the cold eyes of men who, in the name of progress, had decided that the pain of others was the acceptable price of their ambitions. Deliberate inoculation of diseases. Syringes were as feared as blades. In the barracks of Pingfang, the appearance of a doctor with a glass tray loaded with needles meant that another cycle of suffering was beginning. The deliberate inoculation of diseases was one of the most widespread practices in Unit 731, and behind each prick there was a logic that combined military calculation and absolute contempt for human life. Prisoners were selected without distinction: Chinese peasants, partisans, beggars captured on the streets of Harbin, pregnant women, elderly people, and even children. They were made to line up while the doctors chose their subjects with indifference. There was no explanation nor warning. On any given day, a guard would burst into the barrack and point his finger at those who had to follow him. For the chosen, the path ended in a white room where sterilized instruments awaited, prepared to introduce into their blood the seed of disease. The bacteria were cultivated in laboratories within the complex. Petri dishes full of colonies of bubonic plague, anthrax, cholera, or typhus served as an invisible arsenal. These were pathogens designed to spread quickly, selected not for their rarity but for their ability to destroy bodies and propagate as weapons. The declared objective was to perfect the biological power of the empire, but in practice it meant using the prisoners as human incubators. The procedure followed a repeated script. An assistant held the prisoner, another applied the injection in the arm or thigh, and from that instant the countdown began. There were no antibiotics nor treatment. It was passively awaited for the disease to take control of the organism. The doctors noted the exact hour of the inoculation and then recorded each symptom. The initial fever, the chills, the black spots of plague, the bloody vomit of cholera, the difficulty breathing from anthrax. Each phase was clinical data, a number in the notebook, a graph in a report. In some cases, infection was not introduced by needle. Prisoners were released in cells where rats carrying infected fleas ran freely. One bite was enough to transmit plague. In other experiments, contaminated water with cholera or food impregnated with bacteria was given to drink. The doctors observed how relentless diarrhea, extreme dehydration, and deadly convulsions broke out. The intention was clear: to imitate the way these diseases could spread under war conditions. Sadism was disguised as scientific method. There were entire series of experiments in which the same pathogen was inoculated into men and women of different ages to compare the resistance of the bodies. It was studied, for example, whether the young endured more days of fever than the elderly, or whether pregnant women died before adult men. The fetus in those cases was also part of the experiment. It was examined how the infection passed from mother to child and what deformities appeared in the unborn bodies. The most disturbing thing was that the doctors did not seek to cure. There were no trials with medicines that offered hope. The tests were designed to study the fatal progression of the disease. The time it took a body to collapse was the true objective. The agony of the subject, instead of being fought, was recorded with clinical coldness. The hour in which he began to rave, the moment in which he stopped speaking, the exact point in which breathing was interrupted. Each death was a completed experiment. The testimonies that emerged afterward spoke of rooms full of bodies convulsing in parallel. Groups of 20 or 30 prisoners were inoculated with the same disease and observed collectively as if they were plots of a field under cultivation. The guards closed the doors and the doctors passed several times a day to note results. When someone died, he was removed and another placed in his stead. The chain never stopped. There were occasions when inoculation was carried out to test biological weapons on a large scale. Some prisoners were injected with plague and then released into nearby villages where the infection spread among civilians who knew nothing of what was happening in the facility. Thus, the effectiveness of the transmission of the disease was verified, and the corpses of villagers became additional statistics. It was not only about laboratories. The border between experiment and war was deliberately erased. The physical pain was indescribable. Cholera dehydrated until leaving the skin dry, the lips cracked, the eyes sunken. Typhus generated delirious fevers that made prisoners speak in incoherent tongues until they fell unconscious. Anthrax produced blisters that opened into putrid sores, emanating an unbearable stench. Bubonic plague inflamed the lymph nodes to grotesque sizes, which burst beneath the skin. All this was observed with scientific attention, as if each spasm, each vomit, and each suppuration were a precious piece of data. The military doctors spoke of their subjects as material. Bureaucratic language softened the atrocity. A dying man was Case 37. A feverish girl was Case 82. The semantic distance allowed them to manipulate lives as if they were simple test tubes. But inside the cells, the prisoners knew perfectly well that they were nothing more than containers of bacteria, and that sooner or later the body would yield to the poison deliberately introduced. Some tried to resist with the strength of will. There were accounts of peasants who refused to show pain, who remained silent even while fever consumed them as a last act of defiance. But biology was relentless. No spirit could stop the advance of the bacteria running through the blood. Heroic resistance only delayed the inevitable. The doctors, for their part, discussed the results among themselves with coldness. In the meeting rooms, they exchanged mortality graphs, comparative tables, statistical curves. They spoke of the swiftness of cholera compared to typhus, of the effectiveness of anthrax as a weapon compared to plague. Each death fed a databank designed to build an invisible arsenal, a bacteriological power that, in the mind of the High Command, could alter the course of the war. The deliberate inoculation of diseases was perhaps the clearest expression of absolute contempt for human life. It was not about visible tortures nor spectacular mutilations, but about a slow, biological, silent condemnation. The body of the prisoner became a microscopic battlefield in which the bacteria advanced while the doctors observed, taking note of each stage. There was no anesthesia, no palliatives, no intentions to cure, only a programmed wait toward agony. In the barracks, the survivors trembled upon hearing that someone had received an injection. They knew he would not return alive. The rumor spread immediately. He was given cholera, he has plague, he was injected with anthrax. Despair permeated the air. Each new outbreak within the experimentation wards was a reminder that no one was safe, that the body could be invaded at any moment by an invisible enemy forcibly introduced. The legacy of those practices left an indelible shadow. During those years, Unit 731 transformed medical science into a laboratory of death in slow motion. The deliberate inoculation of diseases did not seek to save lives nor relieve pain. It sought to turn human suffering into data and the bodies of thousands into disposable instruments for the construction of weapons that never should have existed. The Kingdom of Ice, Freezing and Hypothermia Experiments. Winter in Manchuria was cruel even for soldiers well fed and dressed in thick wool coats. Temperatures dropped to 30 degrees below zero, and the wind cut the skin like invisible blades. For the prisoners of Unit 731, that natural hostility became the perfect stage of a hell designed by the hand of man. There, in the yards and open-air laboratories, the cold was not an enemy to be defeated, but a tool of torture and experimentation. The guards took the prisoners out of their barracks in the middle of the night when frost covered every surface. Barefoot or barely dressed in rags, they were forced to remain standing in the open. Sometimes they were made to put their hands and arms into buckets of icy water until the skin hardened like marble. The purpose was always the same: to provoke controlled freezing of their extremities. The doctors observed attentively, waiting for the moment when the fingers lost their color and the flesh acquired that white and rigid tone that announced necrosis. The technique most used consisted of spraying water on the arms or legs of the prisoner, then exposing them to the icy wind of the early morning. The process was repeated again and again until the skin cracked when struck with a wooden stick. When the flesh was completely frozen, the doctors knew they could begin with the next phase of the experiment. The victims were taken inside the surgical pavilions, where different attempts at resuscitation were carried out. Some had the frozen part submerged in boiling water, provoking unbearable pain that tore screams of horror. The skin peeled off in large sheets, leaving muscles blackened. Others were placed near bonfires, while the doctors noted the speed with which the heat caused the tissues to detach from the bone. There were also those who were rubbed with whips or beaten to stimulate blood circulation, as if brutality could bring life back to what was already dead. The declared objective of these practices was twofold. On the one hand, they sought to study the effects of freezing on the human body, a vital question for an army that fought in extreme climates such as those of China, Mongolia, or even Siberia. On the other hand, they intended to experiment with possible treatment methods for soldiers frozen at the front, but in reality the prisoners were the material on which meaningless trials were practiced, repeated to exhaustion, whose outcome was always mutilation and death. The spectacle was horrifying. The prisoners screamed until their voices broke, and many fainted from pain before the surgeons finished testing their methods. The most unfortunate survived the first round, only to be exposed to the cold again the next day. The cycle repeated again and again until nothing remained but a lacerated body, dead flesh hanging from bones, extremities that seemed like pieces of rotten wood. There was technical language for all this. In the reports they spoke of optimal freezing time, percentage of circulatory recovery, or degree of necrosis. The reality behind those terms was human suffering elevated to an industrial scale. Each figure was the echo of a scream, each statistic hid a face. The doctors, however, presented the results as if they were academic achievements, convinced they were serving a higher cause. The most chilling stories arose from the attempts to reheat the prisoners with extreme methods. One consisted of forcing fellow captives to embrace tightly the frozen subject using human warmth as therapy. The guards enjoyed that forced humiliation, making women cover agonizing men with their naked bodies while the doctors took notes. In other cases, prisoners were tied to horses freshly exercised, letting the steam of their sweating bodies try to revive the dead flesh. None of this worked, but each failure was recorded as another step in the supposed research. The cold was also used as a tool of selection. There were experiments where the resistance of different ethnic groups or ages against freezing was compared. It was noted how many minutes a young peasant endured, how long an old man took to collapse, how a pregnant woman reacted before falling into unconsciousness. Racism and pseudoscience mixed in those reports, feeding the idea that cruelty could be transformed into knowledge. The barracks were witnesses to the return of those who survived a few more days after the experiment. They entered crawling, with blackened hands, swollen legs full of blisters that oozed pus. Infection spread quickly, and the smell of rotten flesh filled the air. Cellmates knew they would soon be taken again, until nothing useful remained to be recorded in their bodies. Death in those cases was a relief that came late. The most sinister thing was normalization. For the doctors of Unit 731, the freezing of a man was not an act of cruelty, but a routine procedure. There were schedules, protocols, and expected results. Horror was transformed into custom, and human pain into a laboratory tool. That was the most perverse triumph of the machinery, to turn extreme suffering into part of an ordinary workday. Ice, which in other circumstances symbolizes purity or stillness, became the silent executioner of thousands of men and women. The snow that fell on the roofs of Pingfang covered an invisible cemetery, where lay the remains of those who had been used as guinea pigs in the obsession to measure how far the human body could resist before breaking. In the kingdom of ice created by Unit 731, science disguised itself as neutrality to conceal barbarity. Each frozen limb, each organ destroyed by the cold, was proof not of the strength of man against nature, but of the human capacity to turn pain into method. And in those Manchurian dawns, when the wind swept the fields and the frost hardened the earth, the screams that arose from the yards reminded that ice had been turned into an instrument of torture as implacable as fire or steel. Sealed chambers, pressure, gases, and the science of asphyxia. The metallic rumble of the hatch closing was enough to sow terror. Once inside, there was no escape. The pressure and gas chambers rose in the heart of the Pingfang complex like sealed laboratories, where the air itself was turned into executioner. In those compartments, the atmosphere was manipulated at will. It could be compressed until crushing the lungs or filled with poisonous vapors that burned from within. Prisoners were taken there under deceit or by force, and what occurred between those walls remained hidden from the world, reduced to cold reports on the desks of the medical officers. The pressure chamber was a metallic structure of industrial appearance initially designed for military training, but in the hands of Unit 731 it was transformed into an instrument of death. The procedure was simple in its logic and devastating in its consequences. The prisoner was introduced, the hatch was secured, and the air pressure began to be reduced, simulating a vertiginous ascent to great altitude. The human body, unable to adapt to such speed, collapsed violently. The victims first felt a sharp pain in the ears, followed by dizziness and nosebleeds. As the pressure descended, the eyeballs swelled, the veins bulged, and the lungs tore in a futile attempt to balance the missing oxygen. There were those who burst into convulsions, those who screamed until their voices failed, and those who fainted before death reached them. The doctors observed through small windows, noting the exact time when the bodies lost consciousness and recording the degree of internal damage later confirmed in autopsies. In other experiments, the procedure was reversed. The pressure was gradually increased, as if the prisoner descended to submarine depths. The compressed air crushed the sinuses and lungs, causing internal bursts that the doctors documented meticulously. The organs were opened after death to verify the extent of hemorrhages, clots, and tissue rupture. No one was meant to be saved. The only important thing was to calculate the limits of resistance of the human body to extreme environments. The gas chambers, for their part, were intended for chemical weapons testing. The interior was filled with substances such as mustard gas, chlorine, or phosgene, compounds designed to disable entire armies. In the closed space, the prisoners became subjects of forced observation. As soon as the gas was released, the air became unbreathable, the eyes burned like embers, the skin was covered with blisters, and the lungs began to fill with fluid. The coughing was unbearable. The subjects spat blood and fragments of tissue as they slowly drowned. Cruelty was disguised as scientific procedure. There were sessions in which different concentrations of gas were tested to measure the exact lethal dose. Other times, the duration of exposure was varied: 5 minutes, 10, half an hour. The doctors timed with military precision the moment a man fell to his knees or a woman lost consciousness. Each result was recorded in tables with ordered columns, as if they were simple chemical reactions and not the agony of human beings. Mustard gas was one of the favorites for testing. It caused burns on the skin that first appeared as blisters and later as open ulcers. The pain was unbearable, and the most cruel thing was that the victims remained conscious for hours or even days before dying of infection. The doctors, far from stopping, used those bodies to study how the wounds spread and whether there were differences between men and women, young and old. Chlorine and phosgene, on the other hand, acted faster. Chlorine burned the throat and lungs, provoking immediate suffocation. Phosgene, more treacherous, allowed the victim to survive a few hours before the fluid filled the lungs and asphyxia became inevitable. These characteristics were noted with obsessive attention. The gas that killed slowly served different purposes from the one that eliminated immediately. It was the language of a science perverted by war logic. There were combined experiments. At times, prisoners weakened by previous infections were introduced into gas chambers to observe whether the disease accelerated death or modified the reaction to poison. In others, subjects with frozen limbs were taken to the pressure chamber to measure how two different forms of torture interacted. The mind behind these trials sought absolute experimentation, a complete catalogue of human pain in the face of each controlled variable. The atmosphere in the chambers was of mechanical coldness. The metallic walls returned the echo of screams, and the smell of gas impregnated the technicians' clothing. When the hatches opened, the bodies were removed like discarded pieces. Some still breathed faintly and were taken directly to the vivisection rooms to be opened while life slowly escaped. The chain of horrors did not end in the chamber. It was only another phase of the cycle. The guards often spoke among themselves with indifference, as if everything were part of a common job. For them, the chamber was just another instrument, comparable to a rifle or a bomb. But for the prisoners awaiting their turn, that place meant the disappearance of all hope. The mere rumor that someone had been called to the sealed room was enough for the entire barrack to fall silent. It was a fate with no return. The most sinister thing was the justification repeated in the reports. They spoke of military necessity, of advances in chemical and biological defense, of physiological resistance at extreme altitudes. But those technical words concealed a simpler and more brutal truth. The reduction of human beings to disposable guinea pigs, sacrificed in the name of knowledge that never sought to save lives, but to perfect the machinery of death. In the sealed chambers of Unit 731, the air, that indispensable substance for life, was transformed into an invisible enemy. Pressure and gases, manipulated by human hands, became executioners as relentless as the scalpel or the ice. And there, in the hermetic silence of those metallic walls, thousands of screams were trapped forever, smothered by the weight of a science that had renounced all humanity. Human testing ground, live weapons experiments. Dawn in Manchuria had a particular silence, barely interrupted by the distant song of birds and the crunch of frost under boots. But in the plains near the Pingfang complex, that silence was broken by detonations, bursts of rifles and the roar of flamethrowers. It was not a battlefield, although it resembled one. It was an open-air laboratory where prisoners were transformed into living targets to test the effectiveness of Japanese weapons. The trucks arrived early, loaded with chained men and women. The guards pushed them down and led them to the clearings delimited by wire fences. There, the victims were tied to wooden posts or lined up in rows, while the soldiers prepared with grenades, rifles, mortars, and flamethrowers. The official excuse was to evaluate the power of the weaponry, but in practice it meant subjecting human bodies to a catalogue of destruction. The procedure was carried out with the meticulousness of a military exercise. Grenades of different calibers were tested, placed at various distances from the target. When they exploded, the doctors measured the dispersion of the shrapnel, the depth of the wounds, and the speed with which one prisoner died in comparison to another. If a grenade was not sufficiently lethal, it was noted as a defect to be corrected in manufacturing. The shattered body of a peasant served as a statistic for the armament industry. In other experiments, rifles of precision were fired at specific organs. The aim was taken at the chest, the extremities, or the head, with the objective of determining lethality in different areas of the human body. The doctors then approached the still agonizing targets, observing the bleeding, palpating the wounds, recording the time of survival. On occasions, the prisoner was left tied up for hours to measure how long it took to die from bleeding without assistance. The flamethrowers offered a more brutal spectacle. Prisoners were lined up in front of the soldiers, and suddenly a burst of flame enveloped them completely. Fire consumed the clothing in seconds, leaving the skin charred and cracked. The screams were unbearable, and the smell of burned flesh impregnated the air until sunset. The doctors coldly described the depth of the burns and the resistance of the body before collapsing. There was no intention to save anyone. Death was the only foreseen end. Tests with chemical weapons were also carried out in open fields. Barrels of mustard gas or phosgene were released with the wind, while the prisoners, immobile and chained, breathed in the toxic vapors. The soldiers watched from afar, protected with gas masks, while the subjects suffocated in convulsions. The time until the collapse was timed with precision, as if they were runners in a macabre race whose end was already written. The terrain became a true field of ballistic research. There were areas designated for mortar tests. Prisoners were placed in trenches or shallow pits, and the projectiles fell a few meters away. The objective was to study not only the direct impact, but also the effects of the shockwave on human bodies. Some were mutilated, others left deaf, others with internal organs destroyed. Everything was recorded as just another datum in the experiment log. Even heavy artillery found its victims there. There were occasions when short-range cannons were tested, firing against groups of prisoners to observe the dispersion of fragments and the destructive capacity. The scenes were indescribable. Bodies torn to pieces, limbs scattered in the mud, unrecognizable faces. And after each explosion, doctors and soldiers advanced among the remains as if they were archaeologists examining a find, without showing the slightest sign of compassion. Not only conventional weapons were tested, the Japanese also used the prisoners to try prototypes. There were experimental grenades, incendiary projectiles, and even arrows coated with toxins. Each innovation had to be verified on living flesh before being sent to the front. For the prisoners, it meant being victims of a war modernization that advanced at the cost of their lives. In the barracks, the rumor of these experiments circulated strongly. The prisoners knew that those who were taken to the testing fields did not return. Some tried to resist at the final moment, struggling with the guards, but the weapons always imposed silence. Others entered into resigned muteness, aware that their destiny was decided. Hope was so scarce that some preferred the grenade or the bullet rather than the slow agony of an infection in the medical pavilions. The military doctors justified these atrocities with arguments of utility. They said that thanks to those data, the Imperial Army would have more effective weapons, that the sacrifices of the prisoners would allow Japanese lives to be saved at the front. But behind that rhetoric was hidden a harsher reality. Human suffering turned into a disposable testing ground, a cheap resource to perfect the art of killing. Normalization even reached the soldiers who fired. Many were young recruits who received the order to aim and open fire against unarmed men, women, or even children. With time, some became desensitized and saw in it a simple military exercise. The moral degradation was so deep that successful tests were celebrated as if they were well-executed training maneuvers. The testing field of Pingfang was, in its essence, a theater of war without armed enemies. Each prisoner represented a defenseless victim, and each shot, explosion, or burst of flame was a rehearsal whose only audience were the medical officers and the commanders who demanded results. There, human life was worth no more than a bullet and was extinguished with the same speed with which a soldier pulled the trigger. The echo of those detonations remained impregnated in the land of Manchuria. Under the frozen soil and in the mass graves lay the remains of thousands of men and women who did not die in combat, but in experiments disguised as military tests. The wind that blew over the testing field carried with it an indelible memory. That science and war, united in the perversion of Unit 731, had turned experimentation into spectacle and murder into statistics. The forced bodies, gynecological tests, and experimental pregnancies. The horror of Unit 731 did not distinguish ages nor conditions, but few practices revealed such a profound degree of perversity as those destined for women. The female body was turned into a double laboratory. It not only served as an object of individual experimentation, but also as a reproductive vessel for new test subjects. Under the excuse of studying venereal diseases and their transmission, atrocities were committed that today seem inconceivable even within the already endless catalogue of barbarities of Pingfang. In the barracks, the women were separated from the men and kept under constant surveillance. Some were peasant women captured in raids, others political prisoners, and there was no shortage of adolescents torn from their families. From the moment of their entry, they were marked by a particular destiny, to serve as material for gynecological experiments. The vulnerability was absolute, since there was no possible defense against a system that reduced them to simple biological containers. Rape was part of the procedure. Officers and doctors used soldiers infected with syphilis or gonorrhea to force relations with the prisoners. It was not an isolated act of sexual brutality, but a method designed to deliberately transmit venereal diseases. The objective was to observe how they spread in the female organism, how long it took for the symptoms to manifest, and above all, how they were transmitted to the fetus in case of pregnancy. When a woman became pregnant, medical interest multiplied. Pregnancy was seen as a golden opportunity to experiment on two bodies at the same time, the mother and the child. The woman was inoculated with bacteria such as bubonic plague or typhus, and then the effects on fetal development were recorded. Sometimes the gestation was allowed to advance until birth, only to dissect the newborn in search of signs of infection. Other times, the pregnancy was interrupted by vivisection, opening the mother's womb and extracting the fetus still alive, while the doctors observed with a mixture of scientific coldness and bureaucratic cruelty. The suffering of the women was indescribable. They not only had to endure the physical pain of diseases and forced births, but also the absolute degradation of knowing themselves turned into test instruments. Some were raped repeatedly until becoming pregnant again and again. Others were used as subjects for invasive gynecological procedures, ranging from the insertion of rudimentary instruments to experimental surgeries without anesthesia. Infections, hemorrhages, and deaths were so common that the bodies piled up in the pits of the complex. In the medical reports, all this was described with technical language that concealed the horror. They spoke of vertical transmission of pathogens, of teratogenic effects, or of incidents of congenital infection. The reality behind those terms was the dissection of newborn babies, the agony of women bleeding to death, and the systematic destruction of all human dignity. There were also experiments that sought to compare the resistance of the sexes against diseases. Men and women were infected with the same pathogens, and it was observed who survived longer. In those studies, women were seen as especially valuable material because they also offered the variable of pregnancy. The fetuses, treated as specimens, were examined with the same indifference with which the liver or the spleen of an adult was analyzed. Some women, aware of what was happening, tried to resist in desperate ways. There were those who inflicted wounds on themselves to avoid being raped, or who tried to suffocate their newborn children to spare them a worse fate in the dissection rooms. But the guards were relentless. They punished with brutality anyone who dared to sabotage the experiments. Desperation turned into a resigned silence that ran through the women's wards like a mantle of perpetual shadow. The children born in Pingfang rarely survived beyond a few days. Some were executed immediately after birth, considered useless once the experiment was concluded. Others were raised for a short time in miserable conditions, only to be used in new tests. Childhood innocence was no break for the doctors of Unit 731, who saw in those small organisms a unique opportunity to study diseases from the first breath. The use of women also had a component of deliberate humiliation. On more than one occasion, the prisoners were forced to attend the births of their companions, witnessing how the doctors extracted the baby only to open it minutes later. That exposure to the suffering of others was part of the control mechanism, to destroy not only the body, but also the mind of those who were still alive. The echo of those horrors resounded in the barracks. The women knew that, if they became pregnant, their destiny would be doubly tragic. Some prayed for death before the pregnancy advanced. Others, weakened by venereal diseases, resigned themselves to becoming vessels of experimentation until their bodies could endure no more. Fear was constant and hope non-existent. The logic that guided these experiments was as twisted as it was clear. In the mentality of the Japanese High Command, the war could extend into hostile territories where venereal diseases, cold, or malnutrition would decimate the troops. Knowing the behavior of those pathogens in the human body, and particularly in the transmission to new generations, was considered a legitimate military objective. Science, once again, was torn from its purpose of healing and placed at the service of destruction. At the end of each day, the remains of women and children were eliminated in ovens or mass graves. There was no record of their names, only numbers in the clinical files. Individual memory was erased along with the bodies, reduced to statistics and graphs that, for the doctors, represented advances in their grotesque field of research. The gynecological brutality of Pingfang showed how far dehumanization could go when ideology and war erased the limits of morality. The women were treated not as victims of a conflict, but as laboratory instruments, their maternity reduced to an experimental variable and their children to biological samples. In that space of cement and barbed wire, life and creation were perverted in their most elementary forms, transformed into scenarios of systematic pain and death. Stolen childhood, dissection of fetuses and newborns. In the dark universe of Unit 731, even the innocence of birth was perverted in the name of military science. If forced pregnancy had turned women into testing vessels, fetuses and newborns turned out to be the most coveted material for the doctors, for they represented a unique opportunity to study the transmission of diseases from their very origin. There, in the aseptic rooms of Pingfang, life was not welcomed into the world but immediately surrendered to the scalpel. The procedure began long before delivery. Once the woman prisoner became pregnant, she was subjected to deliberate infections, bubonic plague, syphilis, gonorrhea, typhus, or cholera. The interest was to verify how these diseases crossed the placenta, deformed the development of the fetus, or condemned it before birth. Each heartbeat in the maternal womb was recorded not as a sign of life, but as an experimental indicator of a contaminated organism. When the pregnancy reached an advanced stage, the doctors decided the outcome. In some cases, natural delivery was awaited. The newborn barely breathed for a few minutes before being separated from its mother. There was no lullaby nor human warmth. It was placed on a metal table under the operating light. The scalpel descended without delay, opening its tiny chest or abdomen, while the doctors observed the effects of infection on minuscule organs. The crying was quickly silenced, replaced by notes in clinical notebooks. In other cases, dissection was performed before the pregnancy reached term. The mother's womb was opened by vivisection, extracting the fetus still alive or in an advanced stage of gestation. The mother, generally infected, remained conscious until hemorrhage overcame her. The fetus was immediately separated and subjected to examinations seeking to verify how far bacteria had colonized its tissues. It was birth and death in the same surgical act. The doctors described these procedures with language that concealed the cruelty. They spoke of congenital transmission, of comparative analysis of fetal organs, or of intrauterine morphological alterations. Behind those words was hidden the image of small bodies opened on steel trays, with their lungs still moist, their hearts barely formed, their brains palpated by gloved hands that saw no humanity in those creatures. Newborns, who managed to survive for some hours, were also used as test subjects. They were inoculated with bacteria directly into the blood, or they were fed contaminated milk to study the speed with which the disease destroyed such a fragile organism. The outcome was always rapid: convulsions, heartbreaking crying, spasms, and finally death. The medical record noted the exact time of each phase, as if it were a biological clock destined to stop far too soon. There were occasions when doctors compared infected fetuses with others not exposed to diseases. Several were dissected at the same time, aligned on trays to compare the difference in organ size, the presence of sores or malformations. Brutality reached unimaginable levels. Newborn babies were placed side by side like museum specimens, while the doctors pointed with pencils to details on their bodies. The air of the room was impregnated with a penetrating smell of blood and formalin, a mixture that became the constant fragrance of those pavilions. Maternal suffering was equally devastating. Women forced to give birth or to be cut open without anesthesia heard the first cries of their children transformed into the prelude of an immediate death. There was no embrace, no possibility of protection. Some tried to turn their heads to see them one last time, but the guards restrained them with brutality. That instant, when the natural hope of motherhood turned into absolute horror, represented one of the darkest facets of Pingfang. The indifference with which these dissections were executed was absolute. For the doctors, they were not infanticides, but experimental protocols. They discussed among themselves with the same calm with which an academic would comment on results at a scientific congress. Which organ showed greater bacterial colonization? What percentage of fetuses died in the third trimester? How did a newborn react to infection by syphilis? Each answer was celebrated as an advance in knowledge, without anyone questioning the human price of those observations. The scale was terrifying. Dozens, perhaps hundreds of fetuses and newborns passed through those tables. Each one represented an opportunity to collect fresh data. There was no pause between one procedure and another. As soon as one body was disposed of, another replaced it. The chain of death was prolonged day after day, turning motherhood into an endless cycle of horror. The women's barracks became impregnated with fear when a woman became pregnant. Her companions knew what was coming. Childbirth would not be an act of life, but the beginning of a tragedy. Some tried to hide their pregnancies, wrapping themselves in loose clothing or feigning illnesses, but the doctors carried out regular inspections to detect any sign. There was no escape. Each growing womb was seen as a new opportunity for experiment. The fate of those children was one of the best-kept secrets after the war. While there was talk of chemical weapons, freezing, or vivisections, the dissections of fetuses and newborns remained in the shadows for a long time, perhaps because their brutality surpassed even imagination. The idea that trained doctors with university education could open the bodies of babies as if they were simple laboratory objects was so unbearable that for years it was scarcely mentioned in testimonies. However, for those who passed through Pingfang, there was no silence sufficient to erase those images. The memory of small bodies manipulated with indifference, the echo of cries silenced far too soon, the despair of mothers who could never protect their children. All of this became an invisible scar that crossed generations, silencing the witnesses' mass cover-up through murders. The summer of 1945 brought with it a change in the air of Manchuria. It was not only the suffocating heat nor the rumor of war approaching from the west with the Soviet advance, it was the palpable nervousness among officers and doctors of Unit 731. For years they had built an empire of horrors behind the barbed wire of Pingfang. They had dissected the living, frozen bodies, spread diseases and reduced entire villages to ashes with bacteriological weapons. All of it had been recorded in reports, graphs and files. And now, with Japan's defeat imminent, that living archive, the prisoners, became an intolerable danger. The commanders knew that if the Soviets or the Chinese liberated the prisoners, the truth would come to light with a force impossible to conceal. Each survivor would be a walking testimony, a human proof of the crimes committed. The solution, then, was brutal and direct. No one should be left alive. The cover-up did not consist only in destroying documents or facilities, but in erasing from the face of the earth all those who had passed through the experimentation rooms. The orders descended quickly. The barracks were locked tight, and within days systematic executions were organized. Some prisoners were taken to the nearby forest, lined up in trenches previously opened and shot in mass. The echo of the bursts resounded at dawn, while the bodies were covered with lime and earth. Others were strangled in cells, suffocated with gas or poisoned with lethal injections. The priority was that no visible trace remained, not even corpses that could later be identified. There were scenes of indescribable drama. Pregnant women who had been used in gynecological experiments were executed on their stretchers without even being moved. Children who had been born inside the complex were eliminated as if they were waste, buried alongside their mothers. Elderly people, peasants, militants, and prisoners of war met the same fate. In a matter of weeks, the entire population of experimental material was annihilated. The ovens of the complex worked without rest. Bodies were thrown there to be reduced to ashes in a few hours. The dark smoke rose over Pingfang, betraying from a distance the magnitude of what was happening. Those who lived in nearby villages spoke of the unbearable stench that impregnated the air, a mixture of burnt flesh and chemical substances. It was the smell of cover-up, of the deliberate destruction of the human evidence of the crime. At the same time, the destruction of documents began. Medical files, carefully elaborated over years, were incinerated in improvised bonfires. The reports that detailed doses, times of infection, physiological reactions were reduced to ashes, along with photographs and films. But there was something that could not be destroyed with fire: the memory of the prisoners. For that reason, mass murder became the last indispensable piece of the plan. Some officers showed doubts, aware that the magnitude of the massacre would incriminate them even more. But military discipline and fear of punishment for disobedience prevailed. The machinery of the empire admitted no cracks. Silence had to be bought with blood. Thus, even those doctors who in private had felt some scruple became accomplices of the final extermination. The evacuation of the facility was chaotic. Trains loaded with equipment departed for Japan, while human remains were hastily buried in shallow pits. There were mutilated bodies that were never recovered, skeletons scattered beneath the foundations of the complex and ashes buried along with chemical waste. The urgency of the cover-up caused the executioners to make mistakes, leaving behind fragments of bones, teeth, and blood-stained tools. Those remains would be discovered years later, turned into material proof of what was attempted to be concealed. Mass murder was not carried out only in Pingfang. Other branches of Unit 731 in different parts of Manchuria followed the same pattern. The prisoners were executed in mass, the buildings blown up with explosives and the files destroyed. The plan was to erase all trace of the human experimentation network that Japan had built for a decade. The brutality of that summer left deep marks on those who survived on the periphery. Villagers remembered the trucks loaded with bodies that left at dawn, the constant smoke on the horizon and the rumors circulating among soldiers, that everything had to be erased, that no one should know what had happened there. The secret was defended with the same violence with which it had been built. The cover-up did not end with the executions. When the Soviets entered Manchuria, they found a devastated complex, looted laboratories and ovens still hot. The silence was absolute. There were no prisoners alive who could tell what they had seen. That absence of witnesses was in itself proof of the crime. The human void denounced with more force than any file what had happened behind the barbed wire. The doctors and officers who participated in these mass executions continued their lives after the war, many protected by pacts of impunity. But in their memory remained the recollection of those days of fire and blood, in which they decided to murder thousands not out of personal hatred but out of cold calculation, to erase traces, silence voices, guarantee that the horror remained buried. The cover-up through mass murders was the logical culmination of the logic of Pingfang. If for years they had reduced the prisoners to objects of experiment, at the moment of defeat they reduced them to garbage to be eliminated. The science that had begun with scalpels and syringes ended with rifles and ovens, sealing with fire the last chapter of Unit 731. And thus, in the last weeks of the war, thousands of lives were extinguished not in the name of research nor of military victory, but in the name of silence. A silence bought with blood, raised over human ashes and sustained by the impunity of those who turned the cover-up into their last successful experiment. Poisoned villages, Chinese towns turned into testing fields. Beyond the walls of Pingfang, where horror was executed in secret, Unit 731 extended its experiments to a much broader stage, entire villages of Chinese peasants. There, in the middle of the rice fields and dusty roads of Manchuria, bacteriological warfare became reality. They were not anonymous prisoners in a sealed pavilion, but complete communities that were condemned to serve as living laboratories for Japanese biological weapons. The strategy was simple and devastating. The doctors and officers of the unit prepared fleas infected with bubonic plague, anthrax spores, cholera, or typhus cultures. Then those agents were deliberately spread in villages, mixed with food, released in water wells, or transported by contaminated animals. The objective was to measure the speed of propagation, the lethality of the disease, and the capacity to generate uncontrolled epidemics. The civilian population, defenseless and without the slightest preparation, was transformed into the victim of a massive experiment. In some cases, Japanese planes flew over the villages and dropped grains of rice infested with fleas. The children, seeing the food fall from the sky, picked it up with curiosity. Shortly after, the plague spread from house to house, first as fever and lumps in the neck, then as a wave of deaths that swept through entire families. The doctors of Unit 731 arrived afterwards, pretending humanitarian interest, but in reality taking detailed notes of the spread. There were villages where cholera was the chosen tool. The water sources were contaminated so that upon drinking, the population began to suffer violent diarrhea and uncontrollable vomiting. In a few days, bodies piled up in the streets and the survivors could barely bury their dead. Extreme dehydration reduced the peasants to living skeletons before death. The Japanese observed from a distance, satisfied with the magnitude of the epidemic they had provoked. Anthrax also became a protagonist. Its spores were released in pastures where farm animals grazed. The cows and pigs died first, followed by the peasants who consumed their meat. Skin lesions, lung infections, and rapid death were noted with precision in military reports. Each infected village was transformed into a real-scale biological trial, whose results were extrapolated to the possibility of attacking entire cities in times of war. Terror did not only reside in the disease, but in the invisibility of the enemy. The villagers saw no bombs nor rifles. They saw water, food, and animals. They did not understand why suddenly everyone fell ill at the same time. Fear spread faster than the bacteria, generating panic in neighboring communities that abandoned their homes in search of refuge. The desolation of entire empty villages was in itself a side effect that the Japanese noted as an indicator of the psychological power of bacteriological warfare. There were even combined experiments in which several pathogens were simultaneously released in the same village. In this way, they could compare which spread faster or which caused a greater number of deaths. The peasants became guinea pigs of an invisible war that knew no borders. In those scenarios, the soil itself became a biological battlefield, sown with spores that could remain active for years. Human suffering was incalculable. Entire families disappeared in a matter of weeks. The children died in the arms of their parents. The elderly were unable to rise from their beds, and bodies accumulated in improvised pits dug on the outskirts of the villages. Desperation led some to flee, but many were overtaken by the disease before reaching other localities. The result was the spread of regional epidemics that far exceeded the limits of the initial experiments. The testimonies collected after the war spoke of ghost villages, where the only sound was the buzzing of flies over abandoned corpses, empty houses, kitchen utensils still on the tables, orchards left unharvested, signs of a life abruptly interrupted by a microscopic enemy that no one knew how to identify until it was far too late. The few survivors recounted with horror how Japanese soldiers returned not to help, but to collect data, take samples of water, blood, or tissues and leave behind an open-air cemetery. The perversity of these practices lay in their systematic character. They were not accidents of war, but operations planned in detail. The villages were selected according to their size, location, and population density as if they were geographic laboratories. The experiments were repeated in different seasons of the year to verify whether the climate affected propagation. Various dispersion methods were tested, from ceramic bombs full of fleas to food contamination. Each variable was calculated, each death counted. The memory of these poisoned villages became a collective trauma. Entire generations inherited stories of the days when plague descended from the sky or sprang from the water wells. For many peasants, war did not manifest in the form of marching armies, but in the form of inexplicable epidemics that swept away everything. The invisibility of the attack was what made it more terrifying, the feeling that daily life, water, bread, air, could be transformed into a deadly weapon. The shadow of silence, impunity after the war. When Japan surrendered in August of 1945, the walls of Pingfang had been torn down, the ovens hastily extinguished, and the pits hurriedly covered. The Soviets discovered remains, scattered documents, and rumors that confirmed inconceivable atrocities. But the most surprising thing was not the magnitude of the crime, but the fate of those who had committed it. The men who had directed vivisections, deliberate infections, freezing and weapons experiments did not face the justice that corresponded to their brutality. In Tokyo, the International Military Tribunal for the Far East barely touched on the subject. Most of the medical officers responsible for Unit 731 never sat on the bench. The reason was as pragmatic as it was cynical. The United States, in the middle of the Cold War, considered the information obtained from the experiments more valuable than the condemnation of their authors. The data on human resistance to diseases, freezing, chemical and bacteriological weapons were secretly negotiated. In exchange for those files and knowledge, immunity was offered. Thus, men like Shiro Ishii, the commander of Unit 731, escaped the gallows. Far from being repudiated, some continued their careers in Japanese medical institutions. Others collaborated with the United States government itself in secret research. The criminal science of Manchuria was recycled as a strategic tool in the nascent confrontation with the Soviet Union. What had been a laboratory of horror was transformed in the intelligence files into invaluable information. Impunity had a deep cost. For the Chinese and Korean victims, there was never justice nor compensation. The survivors lived with physical and psychological scars, relegated to oblivion while the responsible aged in peace. For decades, the subject remained buried in official silence, hidden behind diplomatic pacts and military conveniences. Only years later, fragments of the truth began to come to light through testimonies and excavations. The impunity of Unit 731 is perhaps one of the darkest chapters of the post-war era. It was not only about the magnitude of the crimes, but about the conscious decision to forgive the guilty in exchange for knowledge. In that sinister trade, justice was sacrificed in the name of science and politics, and the pain of thousands was reduced to a secret useful for new wars.